For weeks, the Graves home echoed with the gentle rhythms of a life finally lived without fear. Thomas repaired the barn roof. Delilah planted a small garden behind the house. Hope learned to walk with her arms outstretched like a wobbly little bird trying to catch the wind. The valley softened around them, as if the land itself was relieved to see peace return to a place long burdened by ghosts and grief. But peace, Thomas understood, wasn't just built, it had to be protected. One crisp morning, cold sunlight washed across the fields as Delilah hung linen to dry. Hope giggled in the grass, plucking wildflowers with chubby fingers, toddling between her mother and a sleepy hen that kept wandering into the yard. Delilah breathed deeply, savoring the simple comfort of the moment, the kind she never thought she'd taste, the kind she once believed belonged to other people, not her. Behind her, the door creaked open. Thomas stepped onto the porch, wiping his hands on a cloth after fixing the hinges in the kitchen. He paused, taking in the sight of his wife and daughter glowing in the morning light. "This house doesn't deserve you," he said softly. Delilah turned, smiling. "Maybe it needed us." His gaze softened even more. "Maybe I did too." She looked down shyly, but warmth bloomed across her cheeks. Hope squealed then, offering a wilted flower to Thomas. He scooped her up, pressing a playful kiss to her belly until she erupted into giggles. Delilah watched them, heart swelling, marveling at how easily Hope responded to Thomas's laugh, to how she reached for him instinctively, like she's always known he was a safe place, a father in everything but name. That afternoon, Thomas took a break from his work and walked into the kitchen where Delilah was kneading dough. Her sleeves were rolled to the elbow, a faint dusting of flour across her cheek. He leaned against the doorway, arms crossed loosely. "You look happier than I've ever seen you," he said. She paused, pressing her hands into the dough one last time. "Because I am." He stepped closer. "I hope you know none of this is owed to me." "I know," she said softly. "That's why it means so much." Her voice held gratitude, affection, and something deeper, something she was learning to give piece by piece, no longer through fear or obligation, but through choice. He cupped her cheek gently, brushing away the flour. Delilah leaned into the touch. "Thomas," she whispered, I've never had someone stay by my side. Not like this." "I'm not going anywhere," he replied. Before she could speak again, Elle let out a gleeful squeal from the living room, ending the quiet moment with toddler-like timing. Delilah laughed, wiping her hands on her apron. "Duty calls," she teased. "Mine too," he answered. Following her inside, Hope had discovered something extraordinary. A broom. She dragged it proudly across the floor, knocking over a bucket, nearly sweeping Thomas's boots, and then clapping for herself as if the entire task were a grand triumph. Delilah scooped her up, laughing into Hope's curls. "You're a little helper." She whispered. Thomas stood beside them, arms slipping around Delilah's waist, steady and certain. She didn't stiffen, didn't flinch. She let herself rest in him, leaning her head on his chest. A family, a real one, made not by blood, but by presence, not by marriage alone, but by healing. That evening, as the sky faded to violet and the mountains turned to silhouettes, Thomas carried a newly finished signboard to the front of the house. He had spent days carving it carefully, smoothing every edge until it matched the care he felt for the two souls living under his roof. He hammered it into place above the front door. The morning after the wedding felt different, not just to Delilah, but to the land itself. The air carried a warmth that didn't belong to winter. The sunlight seemed gentler, touching the newly painted windows, the fresh porch boards, even the dust motes inside the house with a kind of reverence. Delilah woke before Thomas and patted softly across the wooden floor, careful not to wake Hope, who slept curled into a tiny ball in a cradle. The house was quiet, but not empty. Every corner held the soft breathing of a place finally lived in, a place that wanted to be a home again. She tied her hair in a loose braid, then stepped into the kitchen. Bread dough was already right, kneaded it after sunset while humming to Hope, feeling something she hadn't felt in years. The joy of preparing food for a future that made sense. Outside, Thomas was already at work. She watched through the window as he hammered the last plank into the back shed. His sleeves were rolled, sun catching the sweat along his arms. He paused now and then, sometimes to admire a joint he'd fitted perfectly, sometimes to glance back toward the house as if checking she was still there. And each time he looked, she felt something warm ease inside her chest. Hope toddled awake with a squeal shortly after, arms stretched high like a little queen demanding her attendant. Delilah scooped her up and kissed her cheek, earning a delighted giggle. "All right, little one," she whispered. "Let's see what this day brings." By midday, the house bustled with new life. Neighbors stopped by with small milk from the Jenkins family, a basket of biscuits from the blacksmith's wife, a jar of raspberry preserves from the schoolteacher. "It's the least we can do," the women insisted. "You've turned that man's house around," one said, with a wink, "and given that child a chance." Delilah flushed with shy gratitude each time. She wasn't used to generosity without price. Thomas lingered near the doorway when people came, leaning against a frame with a quiet satisfaction. It wasn't pride in the house. It wasn't even pride in his work, it was pride in her. Every time someone praised Delilah, Thomas's eyes softened. Every time Hope babbled at a visitor, he smiled like he'd forgotten how grief once hollowed him out. And when Delilah caught him looking at her, he didn't look away anymore. That afternoon, with the chores done and Hope napping peacefully, Delilah found Thomas in the backyard repairing the porch rail. The sky above them stretched endlessly blue, the kind of sky that made her think, maybe her life could open as wide. She walked toward him, brushing sawdust off his shoulder gently. "You work too much," she teased. He straightened, wiping his brow. "You clean too much." She laughed a small, free sound that surprised them both. Thomas leaned against the rail, studying her with an expression she couldn't quite name. Admiration, gratitude, something deeper. "You know," he said slowly, "a house can be rebuilt, with wood and nails, but making it a home, that takes something else." Delilah shifted, suddenly aware of how close they were. "I'm trying." "You're doing more than trying," he murmured. Silence settled between them, not uncomfortable, but charged. The wind lifted the hem of her dress. A strand of hair slipped loose from her braid. Without thinking, Thomas reached up and tucked it behind her ear. His fingers brushed her skin. Delilah inhaled sharply, not in fear, in feeling. Thomas immediately pulled back, hand dropping as though unsure he'd crossed a line. "I'm sorry," he said. "I didn't mean you did," she whispered. "And it was all right." He froze. She stepped closer, closing the last bit of distance between them. "Thomas, I don't want to live in fear anymore. Not of men, not of myself, not of wanting something good." His throat worked. Delilah. Her name on his tongue sounded like a prayer. She placed a hand on his chest, feeling his heartbeat beneath her palm. He covered her hand with his own, rough skin warm and steady. For a long moment, they stood like that too, people carved by loss, learning the shape of something new. Delilah broke the silence with a soft confession. "I want this," she said. "I want us. I want a life that doesn't hurt." Thomas let out a breath he didn't know he'd been holding. "You deserve that," he said, "and I'll spend every day making sure you have it." Her eyes shimmered, but she didn't look away. Then he bent his forehead gently to hers. Rush. The wedding wasn't grand, and maybe that's why it felt so right. No crowds, no gossiping neighbors, no loud music or fancy dresses. Just a cottonwood tree behind the house, its branches stretching wide like welcoming arms, filtering warm sunlit across the grass. Delilah stood under that tree in a pale blue dress she had sewn herself from leftover fabric. It wasn't perfect. One sleeve sat a little higher than the other, and the hem dipped unevenly near her ankle, but it was hers. More importantly, it was the first dress she had ever chosen for herself. Hope toddled around her feet, gripping fistfuls of Delilah's skirt for balance, her curls bouncing in the light wind. When the baby giggled, the sound chimed through the entire yard like tiny bells. The preacher from town cleared his throat, looking both honored and slightly nervous. This was not the kind of ceremony he usually presided over. Weddings in Dry Hollow were typically loud, rowdy affairs with half the town attending and someone inevitably firing a celebratory shot into the air. But this was quiet, sacred, almost private enough to feel fragile. Thomas stood opposite Delilah, dressed in his best shirt, sleeves rolled neatly, hair combed for the first time in months. His eyes didn't leave her, not once. If the world had fallen away around them, he might not have noticed. The blacksmith's wife held Hope gently, bouncing her on her hip. One of the school teachers who'd grown fond of Delilah after seeing her calm a colicky toddler stood beside her, smiling warmly. When the preacher began, his voice was soft, as if careful not to disturb the moment. "We're gathered here today in the presence of God, the winter wind, and the cottonwood that's seen more years than all of us combined, to join Thomas Graves and Delilah Carter in marriage." Delilah's breath trembled. Thomas reached out his hand. Delilah placed hers in his dot, not with fear, not with hesitation, but with choice. The preacher nodded to Thomas first. "Sheriff, you're a vow." Thomas took a steady breath. When he spoke, his voice carried honesty without trying to sound poetic or grand. "Just real. I'll never raise my hand in anger," he said. "I'll never walk away from either of you. I'll build this home stronger than before, and I'll fill it with peace." Delilah's eyes shimmered. Then it was her turn. Her hands trembled as she repeated the preacher's words. She wasn't used to speaking promises. Not ones meant for her, not ones meant to last. But when the preacher finished and gave them leave to seal their marriage with a kiss, Delilah didn't wait. She leaned forward and kissed Thomas first. It wasn't timid. It wasn't shy. It was a woman's kiss, sure, brave, full of years she'd never been allowed to live. Thomas pulled her in gently, one hand cupping the back of her head, the other settling on her waist. Hope clapped her hands, squealing in delight as if she understood everything. The preacher chuckled. "Well, that's a mighty fine start." Later that evening, as the sun dipped low and the sky turned the color of faded rose, Thomas carried a wooden sign onto the porch. The letters were hand-carved, rough around the edges but proud. Graves' home. Thomas, Delilah, and Hofi nailed it into place above the freshly painted doorway. Delilah stood beside him, one hand resting lightly on his shoulder, the other wrapped around Hope's chubby fingers. The house behind them glowed with lamplight through the windows they had scrubbed clean, and the curtains she'd sewn this morning danced softly in the warm breeze. This wasn't the same house Thomas had lived in with ghosts for long years, and she wasn't the same woman who had collapsed on the church steps begging for help. Together they had carved something new from the ashes of their pasts. When Thomas stepped back to admire the sign, Delilah swallowed the emotion rising in her throat. "I was beaten for birthing a girl," she said softly, "but that girl, she led me home." Thomas looked at her, then really looked like he had the night he found her bleeding and terrified in the snow. But this time, the look held warmth, certainty, and something like awe. Hope tugged on Delilah's skirt and babbled, reaching to the sign as if claiming it for herself. Delilah scooped her up. "Look, baby," she whispered. "This is your home too." Thomas placed a gentle hand on the small of Delilah's back. She leaned into it instinctively, naturally, like it was a place her body had been waiting to fit in the cool evening air. Under the cottonwood tree that had witnessed their vows, something settled quietly around them, something steady, something real. A family. When night finally fell, they sat on the porch swing Thomas had rebuilt, its wooden slats smooth and warm. Beneath them, Hope fell asleep, curled against Delilah's chest, humming tiny breaths, her fingers loosely gripping the ribbon Thomas had saved from his son's cedar box. The days that followed carried a softness Delilah had almost forgotten existed. Morning light spilled through the freshly washed windows, dancing across the wood floors. The house smelled of bread baking, new paint drying, and something she had never associated with a home before: peace. One morning, Thomas carried a small cedar box into the kitchen. Its surface was smooth, freshly sanded, and faintly fragrant with resin. Delilah sat at the table with Hope in her lap, the baby chewing on a wooden spoon like it was the most fascinating object in the world. Thomas set the box down in front of her, his movements slow, almost hesitant. "I used to keep my son's things in here," he said quietly. "After the fire, I packed it away." Delilah's fingers traced the carved lid. She paused, recognizing the weight that lived behind those words. "I'm sorry," she whispered. He gave a single nod, neither accepting nor rejecting her sympathy, just acknowledging it, and opened the lid. Inside lay a silver rattle, darkened around the edges but still gleaming where light touched it. Beside it was a faded blue ribbon, frayed but lovingly kept. Then Delilah noticed something new carved inside the lid, fresh, clean strokes in the wood. "Hope Graves, 1884. Her breath caught. Her hand flew to her mouth. Her eyes filled, but no tears fell. She looked at him not as the sheriff who had saved her, but as the man who carved her daughter's name next to his own child's. Someone who wasn't just offering safety, but a place, a future, a claim of the heart. "She's yours too?" she asked softly. Thomas didn't hesitate. He nodded once. Then, even quieter, "If you'll have me. This home is for 3 people, not ghosts." The words felt like sunlight after a long winter. Delilah turned to her. The window. Hope stood on wobbly legs at the sill, hands pressed to the glass, watching the chickens in the yard. Golden morning light wrapped around her tiny form like a blessing. Delilah looked back at Thomas. "Double quotes, yes," she said. Her voice didn't tremble. "Yes, it is." Time moved differently after that. Slower, warmer. Thomas rebuilt the porch swing, smoothing the wood so carefully that Delilah wondered if it was meant for her hands specifically. And every evening after chores they would sit there together, Hope on her lap, Thomas carving small toys from pine wood, and the whole valley stretched before them in gold. Sometimes they talked. More often, they didn't. Silence between them wasn't heavy anymore. It was comforting. But there were moments, small ones, when the air shifted. A brush of fingertips as they passed a bucket. A shared glance with more meaning than either dared speak. A laugh escaping Delilah so easily that she surprised herself. One evening, after the sun dipped low and the house filled with firelight, Delilah hung a new curtain in the kitchen window. She'd stitched tiny forget-me-nots along the edge. Something beautiful for no reason other than she wanted it to be. Thomas watched her from the doorway, arms crossed loosely. "You've made this house look new," he said. She turned, cheeks warming from both heat and embarrassment. "I just cleaned what needed cleaning." He shook his head slightly. "No, you gave it life." The compliment felt strange, and for so gentle she almost didn't know what to do with it. But she carried it with her long after the moment passed. That night, long after Delilah had tucked Hope into her cradle and the house had grown quiet, she stood in the hallway, staring at the closed door to Thomas's room, her heart flood confused. Hopeful, unsure. She wasn't his property. She wasn't his obligation. She wasn't something owed or traded. But she was here, and so was he. Thomas stepped out of the bedroom just then, a folded wool blanket tucked under his arm. He startled lightly when he saw her. "I was just heading to the porch," he said. Delilah nodded, fiddling with her fingers. "Hope's asleep." "That's good." "Silence, Thomas," she began softly. He looked at her, waiting, not demanding, not assuming. Delilah swallowed. "I thank you for everything." His shoulders relaxed. "You don't owe me thanks." She stepped closer, just enough that he could feel the warmth of her presence. "I know. That's why I'm giving it freely." Something shifted in his eyes, then something like longing, softened by restraint. He didn't reach for her, she didn't step back. But between them, something new and fragile bloomed. The next morning, sunlight fell across the yard in long golden bands. Delilah hung laundry while Hope toddled around in the grass, chasing a butterfly with wobbling enthusiasm, and Thomas stepped onto the porch. Coffee in hand, the sight before him made him pause. The woman who had arrived broken on the church steps now, standing tall, strong, alive, the child laughing at her feet. He cleared his throat. The morning of the hearing arrived colder than any day before it, as if the Wyoming winter wanted to test Delilah one last time. The sky hung low, gray and heavy, and Dry Hollow's small courthouse stood like a pale sentinel at the end of Main Street. Folks bundled in wool coats and shawls lingered on the benches outside, whispering in tight circles. Weddings drew crowds. But this was different. The sheriff's wagon rolled to a stop and Thomas stepped down first. He turned back immediately, offering his hand to Delilah. She hesitated, not from fear of him, but from the weight of what she was about to do. Hope was already with a kind neighbor, swaddled and sleeping, kept far from the danger of the moment. Thomas draped his long coat over Delilah's shoulders before she could argue. It hung heavy and warm around her, nearly swallowing her frame. "Don't have to do this alone," he said quietly. Delilah looked up at him, her breath turning to mist in the cold air. "I know," she whispered. Then she stepped out of the wagon and walked toward the courthouse doors. Inside, the wood floors creaked beneath the boots of townsfolk, who had never imagined they'd see a woman stand against her husband in court. People shifted awkwardly, pretending not to stare. The judge sat at the front, an older man with silver hair, soft eyes, and hands that trembled only when he removed his spectacles. Delilah took her seat at the witness stand. Her palms were cold, her heart a drum, but her voice, when she finally spoke, her name was steady. "State your name for the record," the judge said. "Delilah Carter." A murmur rippled through the crowd. Everyone in Dry Hollow knew that Carter's, knew Jet's temper, knew the bruises she'd worn from time to time, but they had never heard Delilah speak like this, clear, calm, unshaking. The prosecutor stood. "Mrs. Carter, why are you bringing charges against your husband, Jedediah Carter?" Delilah lifted her gaze to the crowd, then back to the judge. "Because he beat me," she said simply. The room went still. "Why?" the prosecutor asked softly. Delilah inhaled once. A deep, slow breath hand met the prosecutor's eyes. "For birthing girls." It was as if the words struck the room like lightning. Several people flinched. A woman in the back pressed a hand to her mouth. Even the judge straightened, stunned into silence. Delilah continued, her voice even but threaded with exhaustion. "I was sold to him when I was 16. He wanted a son. I gave him 3 daughters. After the first, he left for 3 days without food or money. After the second, he smashed the baby's crib. After the third," her breath faltered for the first time, but she kept going. "He suspected she was a girl before I even delivered. He beat me until I lost her." Tears slipped from the eyes of a few women in the gallery. "They never had names," Delilah said. "He wouldn't let me name them. He said it was a waste of time." She swallowed hard. "This 4th one, she's a girl too. And when I told him, he hit me again. So I ran. I ran because I knew if I stayed, he would kill her." The prosecutor nodded gently. "And your husband? He would have buried her like the others," Delilah said. "He would have." The judge turned to Jed, who sat slouched behind the railing, arms crossed defiantly, anger simmering in his muddy eyes. "Mr. Carter," the judge said, "do you deny these charges?" Jed scoffed. "She's lying. She ran off with my kid. She's simple in the head." Nobody in the room believed him, not anymore. Not after what they'd heard. Not with Thomas Graves standing firm in the back, arms folded, watching everything, with sharp, steady eyes. "The jury of 12 returned in under an hour. Jedediah Carter," the judge said, his voice booming across the room. "You are sentenced to 10 years in the Wyoming Territorial Prison for aggravated assault, battery, and endangering the life of a child." Jed exploded, cursing, but the bailiffs dragged him away. The sound of the cell door slamming shut echoed through the whole building. Delilah didn't smile, didn't cry. She just let out a slow breath, as if releasing the last grip Jed had ever held on her. Outside, the crowd parted to let her through. No pitying stares, no judgment, just quiet respect, quiet acknowledgement. Thomas waited by the wagon. When she reached him, he placed a gentle hand on her shoulder. "You didn't deserve silence," he said. Delilah looked down at his hand, then up into his steady gaze. "No one ever said that before," she whispered. Tom had helped her climb into the wagon, then took his place beside her. As the wagon wheels rolled away from the courthouse, she let her hand rest in her lap, open, unsure, but no longer clenched with fear. She had spoken, and this time, a whole room had listened back at the homestead. Days stretched into something softer. The hammering began the next morning. Thomas stood on the charred beams of the back room, the same room where fire had once claimed everything he loved. His shirt clung to his back with sweat as he tore up scorched floorboards, splinter by splinter. Delilah watched from the doorway, hope perched on her hip. She didn't step inside the room, still carried the ghost of his past, but she watched him rebuild piece by piece. "I'm making something for the living now," he said, pausing to wipe his brow. Delilah didn't reply. She didn't need to. She just held Hope closer, as if grounding them both. For 2 weeks, the valley echoed with sawing, hammering, and the night settled gently over Dry Hollow. But inside Thomas Graves's house, the warmth of the fire held its ground. Hope lay sleeping on the quilt, her tiny chest rising and falling in slow, steady breaths. Delilah sat cross-legged beside her, watching each movement like it was a miracle. Maybe it was. After everything she'd lost, after everything stolen from her, this little life still clung on. Thomas appeared in the doorway, touching his hat like a silent greeting before easing into the room. The shadows softened around him now. The man who used to be swallowed by grief looked, for the first time in years, like someone living again. He crouched beside the sleeping child. "She's tougher than she looks," he murmured. Delilah smiled faintly. She didn't come from weakness. Their eyes met, and for a breath, neither looked away. Later, as the evening settled into stillness, Delilah followed Thomas into the spare bedroom, his bedroom once, though it looked untouched by time. She held a folded wool blanket in her arms, one sheet found in the back of a trunk. "I thought this might help keep the draft off," she said softly. Offering it to him, their fingers brushed just barely, but it was enough to send a startled flutter through her chest. Thomas's jaw tightened, though not from discomfort, or like something he'd forgotten how to feel. He nodded, accepting the blanket. "Every home needs softness," Delilah added before she could stop herself. Thomas looked at her then. "Really?" "Looked. I forgot that," he said, voice almost a whisper. Delilah's breath caught. She gave him the smallest smile, fragile but real. The kind of smile that felt like opening a door that had been locked for years. The days passed quietly, but not empty. Delilah cleaned the house room by room, sweeping away years of dust and sorrow with a gentleness that surprised her. Thomas worked outside, fixing broken fence posts, clearing brush, tending to chores that had long been put off. Hope spent her days babbling to shadows and wooden spoons, crawling across the quilt Thomas had laid out near whichever window caught the sun. For the first time in a long time, peace didn't feel like a stranger. Then peace shattered. It happened on a crisp afternoon, sunlight dancing across the yard as Delilah hung linen to dry. Hope sat in a woven basket beside her, chewing happily on a cloth doll. The breeze carried the scent of stew from the kitchen window, the kind of day that felt almost normal, almost safe. Then thunder cracked across the earth, not from the sky, but from hoofs. A horse stormed in from the east, kicking up dirt and snow, headed straight for the house. Delilah froze, sheets clenched in her hands. She knew that horse. She knew that slumped, drunken silhouette in the saddle. The stench of whiskey and rage reached her long before his words did. "Jed Carter, you stole my wife," he bellowed, sliding off the saddle with the grace of a falling tree. His eyes were bloodshot, wild, his beard unkempt. He pointed a shaking finger at the house. "And my child." Delilah stepped forward without fear this time. Her voice rose, steady and fierce enough to make the horse flinch. "I birthed 3 before her," she said. 3 girls. "And you beat the life out of each one," Jed snarled, staggering closer. "You were mine. You're still mine. You will not touch this one," Delilah shot back, lifting her chin. The air crackled. Jed didn't see Thomas step around the side of the house, silent as a shadow. Didn't see the way the sheriff's hand hovered near his holster, or the steel in his eyes. Jed spit into the dirt. "Think that badge makes her yours?" Thomas didn't react, didn't flinch, didn't answer. He didn't have to. His presence alone was enough, calm, grounded, unshakable, and that terrified Jed more than a drawn gun. But anger overran sense. With a drunken roar, Jed charged. It happened in a blur. Jed lunged, fist swinging wild. Thomas sidestepped, grabbed his arm, twisted it behind his back, and dropped him face first into the dirt hard enough to knock the wind out of him. Jed kicked and cursed, but Thomas stayed stone still, kneeling on the man's back, breathing. "Controlled, you are under arrest," Thomas said, snapping iron cuffs around Jed's wrists, "for domestic assault, battery, and endangering the life of a child." Delilah watched, hope clinging to her skirt, tiny fingers digging into the fabric. Her heart hammered, but not from fear, from something that felt like justice, real justice. Neighbors gathered behind fences, whispering, stunned. No one in Dry Hollow had ever seen a man arrested for beating his wife. It was always the woman who had to endure, Always the man who went free. But not today. Thomas Graves drew a line. Jed was hauled into the sheriff's wagon and taken straight into town. People stood outside their shop. The hours crawled by in that quiet Wyoming house, the fire in the hearth still cold, the only warmth coming from the heavy coat Thomas had wrapped around Delilah. The baby, still unnamed, slept fitfully, little fists twitching as if her fragile body already knew the world wasn't safe. Delilah didn't sleep. She couldn't. Each time the wind rattled the shutters or the floor groaned, her muscles tensed, ready to run. Her body ached from labor, from bruises, from terror that hadn't yet eased its grip. She held the baby tucked under her chin and breathed her in, memorizing the newborn scent as if it might keep them both alive. Somewhere near dawn, the baby whimpered, a thin, frightened sound. Delilah pressed her close, but the tiny body felt too hot, fever hot. Her heart lurched. No, not again, she whispered, her voice shaking. She had lost 3 little girls already. She would not lose this one. She couldn't. Her legs felt weak, but fear shoved her upright. She hurried across the wooden floor, nearly stumbling as she swung open the bedroom door. "Sheriff," she cried, please help her." Thomas was on his feet before her voice had even stopped trembling. He crossed the room in 3 strides. When Delilah pressed the bundle into his arms, she didn't think, she just acted, trusting him without understanding why. "She's burning up," Delilah choked. "I don't know what to do. I've never, none of them, please." Thomas gathered the baby gently, more gently than any man had ever touched anything of hers. He knelt by the dead hearth and started working like he'd done this 100 times, stoking the embers, adding wood, coaxing the flame back to life. The fire grew slowly, crackling warmth into the room. He wrapped the newborn in layers of blankets, placing her close to the heat but not too close. Then he dipped a cloth into warm water and set it on her forehead with careful, sure movements. Delilah sank to her knees beside him, her breath tight and ragged. She couldn't take her eyes off the baby's tiny face. "No man ever looked at my child gentle," she whispered, not even realizing she'd said it aloud. Thomas didn't reply. He just reached behind a mantel and pulled down a small wooden box, old but well kept, the lid carved with a name burned into the grain. "Mary Graves." Delilah swallowed. She didn't know the story, but she understood the HEAVNS. Thomas opened the box and took out folded linens, small glass vials, things he hadn't touched in years. With his hunting knife, he slowly carved another name along the inside edge of the lid. The letters were careful, almost reverent. "Hope." Delilah gasped softly, her hand covering her mouth. The baby let out a small sigh at that moment, as if accepting the name, as if claiming her place in the world. Her tiny fists unclenched, and her breathing steadied by the faintest measure. "She lived," Thomas murmured, still watching her chest rise and fall. It wasn't a guess. It wasn't a reassurance. It was a promise. Delilah's eyes lifted to him. She had seen many expressions on men: anger, hunger, amusement, cruelty, but never this. Never a man offering care without expecting anything back. Never a man meeting her fear with quiet certainty. She couldn't speak, could only nod. And in that nod was something small but genuine. Trust. Not much, but more than she had given anyone in years. As the baby slept more peacefully, Delilah wiped her eyes with the back of her hand. She wasn't crying from grief this time, or fear. It was something new, something soft, for the first time since running into the snow. She breathed without shaking. When morning finally broke, thin sunlight filtered through the dusty window. That house, long abandoned except for Thomas's restless nights, looked almost golden in the early light. Delilah gathered her strength and stepped into the parlor, baby Hope tucked close. The room smelled of old ash and stale air. Dust rose in slow spirals where the sun struck the floor, but Delilah moved through it quietly, cleaning instinctively, almost reverently. She found the old photo on the mantel, a woman with soft eyes holding a child who shared Thomas's smile. Beside it sat a dried lavender vial, then the ivory scarf, delicate, nearly untouched by time. Her fingers brushed the fabric just as Thomas stepped in the doorway. Delilah flinched and lowered the scarf quickly. "I'm sorry," she blurted. "I didn't mean to touch her things." Thomas's expression softened, though grief pulled at the edges of his eyes. "They're just things," he said quietly. "You're alive." Those words settled heavy inside her. Not scolding, not cold, just truth. Later she held clean the hearth while Thomas fetched water. By noon, a pot of stew simmered on the stove, something the house hadn't smelled in years. Thomas stepped out to the porch, carving a piece of pine while watching smoke curl from the chimney as though witnessing something sacred. Neighbors drifted by throughout the day pretending to stroll, pausing to whisper. "That's Jed Carter's wife," someone murmured. "The sheriff took her in," another said. "Lord help him." Their looks stung. But before Delilah could shrink away from the window, Thomas stood from the porch and addressed the small crowd. "She's under my protection," he said, voice steady and low. "Anyone touches her answers to me." The murmuring stopped. Boots shuffled. Folks scattered. Winter of 1879 wrapped, dry, hollow. Wyoming in a kind of cold that felt personal, like the wind was whispering warnings between every drifting snowflake. The town had already shut down for the night. Lamps glowed behind curtains. Chimneys sighed out thin ribbons of smoke. and the church at the far end of Main Street was the only thing still awake, its steeple lantern flickering like a lonely watchman. Through that biting wind came Delilah Carter. She wasn't walking so much as stumbling, her boots dragging trenches in the snow. Her dress was torn across the shoulder, stained dark where blood had dried stiff against her chest, wrapped in a fraying linen swaddle. A newborn whimper too weak to cry, too new to understand fear, already touched by it anyway. Delilah's breath hitched, each inhale scraping her throat like broken glass. She smelled of birth, sweat, tobacco, and terror. When she reached the church steps, her knees buckled. She braced one hand against the door, the other clutching the baby close. Her knuckles knocked soft at first, then harder. "Please," she whispered, voice barely a thread. "Please, help us." For a moment, nothing. Then the door cracked open just enough for the pastor to peer out. His eyes landed on her bloody dress, then dropped to the bundle in her arms. A shadow of discomfort passed across his face. "We can't take sides in a husband and wife's troubles," he murmured, and the door clicked shut. Delilah didn't scream, didn't pound. She simply lowered her head, holding the baby tighter, whispering again, but now it wasn't to anyone on the other side of the door. "Please, she's all I have left." She had been 16 when her father sold her to Jed Carter, man twice her age and half as kind as a rattlesnake. Jed wanted one thing, a son, and he made sure she never forgot it. At 18 she delivered a girl. Jed disappeared for 3 days, drunk and furious. At 19 she had another. Jed smashed a chair into a wall and called her cursed. At 21, pregnant again, she whispered through her door, "I think it's a girl." Jed didn't wait for the truth. He beat her until she miscarried. That tiny life flickered out before Delilah even had the chance to hold her. 3 daughters gone, no graves, no names. Dot and Jed never stopped trying, never stopped hitting, never stopped blaming her. This 4th baby should have been a miracle born with a soft cry and a head full of dark curls. But the moment Delilah whispered, "She's a girl," Jed's face twisted into something monstrous. "All you do is birth useless mouths," he roared. His fists flew, her back, her shoulder, her ribs. She curled her body around the newborn, taking the blows meant for a child who had been alive only minutes. Then instinct took over, sharp, desperate, wild. She fled barefoot into the cold, into the dark, into the unknown. That's where Sheriff Thomas Graves found her. He was trudging home from the saloon, coat dusted in snow, hat pulled low. Silence usually suited him. He'd lived in it since the night a house fire stole his wife and young son. 4 years later, grief still lived behind his eyes, and then he saw her crumpled on the church steps, covered in blood, a trembling infant pressed to her chest. Delilah lifted her face just enough to meet his gaze. "He hit me," she rasped, "because she's a girl." Thomas's jaw tightened. He said nothing at first, just crouched, shrugging off his heavy coat and draping it over her shoulders. "You don't have to say more," he said softly. "Let me carry you both." She froze. Fear had taught her to distrust kindness. She waited for the catch, the trick, the hidden condition. But Thomas didn't reach for her like a man claiming property, only like someone trying to keep a stranger from collapsing into the snow. After a moment, she nodded. He scooped her up, not rushed, not rough, one arm under her legs, the other bracing her back, careful not to jostle the baby tucked between them. Delilah sagged into him, spent. The church stayed shut. Behind them the street was silent, and Thomas, who hadn't let himself step into his own home for more than a few hours at a time since the fire turned and carried them toward it anyway. Because the doctor's cabin meant questions. Questions meant gossip. Gossip meant Jed, and Jed meant death. Inside his dim, dusty house, Thomas hesitated just past the doorway. He felt the weight of old memories pressing down, his wife's mug still sitting on the table, the hearth cold, shadows lying thick across the floor. But Delilah let out a small cry of pain, and that pulled him forward. He carried her straight into the bedroom he hadn't touched in 4 years. The quilt on the bed was still folded neatly, his wife's last touch preserved like a fragile relic. Gently, he laid Delilah down. Her eyes flew open in panic. "What are you doing?" she whispered, bracing as if expecting another blow. "You need a bed," he said quietly. "I'll sleep outside." She blinked, stunned. Something in her posture loosened, if only slightly.